Hello and good evening to all of you who've joined us today. On behalf of Flame School of Communication, we extend a warm welcome to all the attendees for the International Research Seminar Series. I am Sandeep Roy, Faculty of Advertising and Branding at the Flame School of Communication, your moderator for this evening. Before we introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would request Professor Dr. Preetha Menon, Faculty of Advertising and Branding and Head of the Department of Media and Journalism at Flame University, to share a few words on the philosophy and the vision of the International Research Seminar Series. Over to you, Professor Menon.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Welcome once again to all the attendees who are coming here for probably the fifth time, because this is the fifth session in our series. We have already had 8 distinguished speakers through the series, and in the coming months, we hope to see another 5 or 6 additional speakers by the end of, or the closing of the session, which will happen in December. So welcome once again to all the new joinees and patrons who have been around with us for all the 5 sessions. The International Research Seminar Series, for all of you who have joined for the first time, is an initiative that has that has come from the Flame School of Communication, largely to address the issues that are in the market currently, which are relevant to both the businesses as well as to researchers. So this platform is a space where you learn about things around research, largely related to 3 themes. The first theme is research methods. So the kind of research that is used in communications and marketing is one track where we'd be discussing different methods. In the past, we have discussed methods like experimentation, qualitative research, literature review, etc., for communications management. The other track that we have is contemporary issues in marketing. So today's session is one such session, which is going to be in the space of contemporary issues in marketing. Here too, we have had past sessions, and you would see more in the future. The third is industry-academia relationships, or industry-led research. So we have in the past had academicians or researchers from the industry who tell you exactly how things work there, the kind of issues that they're dealing with, the ways in which they try and solve it. So this is the kind of, so we are trying to bring in questions that are relevant to the industry, which hopefully with this relationship between industry and academia, we hope to solve in the future. In the coming months, especially specifically in October, we have planned 2 sessions, one in the space of methods, and the method that we are going to discuss in October is going to be case study as a method of solving a problem or understanding a phenomena. And the second talk is going to be in the space of CSR, which is corporate relations, and how that is going to affect marketing communications, or the relationship between CSR and consumer behavior. So that's going to be something that we are going to deal with in October. And further, in November, we have planned a session for a workshop, which is going to be a writing workshop. So there would be methods in which how you can write. And then we'd also like participants to join in a writing workshop. So this is what we have planned for the coming months as well. So I thought I'd just give you a heads up, and over to you, Sandeep, for the rest of the session.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Menon. We are now delighted to introduce Professor Dr. Zubin Sethna, distinguished speaker for this evening, to share his thoughts on neuromarketing and consumer behavior in the context of our topic today around contemporary issues in marketing and communications. Professor Sethna is a full-tenured professor of entrepreneurial marketing and consumer behavior. In 2020, he was appointed by the World Economic Forum in Davos as an expert in entrepreneurship, the future of consumption, and family businesses. Professor Sethna is the editor-in-chief of the prestigious Journal of Research in Marketing and Entrepreneurship, and regularly reviews various other marketing and entrepreneurship journals. He's a qualified marketing practitioner as well as an entrepreneur. He has successfully launched 6 businesses, one of which won a national award in the UK, and in his capacity as managing consultant at Baresman Consulting, he has integrated marketing strategy communications along with management consultancy and training for numerous organizations internationally and across a variety of industries like healthcare, professional services, music, travel, manufacturing, retail, IT, etc. He's also written 2 of the best-selling books in consumer behavior and entrepreneurial marketing with global perspectives. Professor Sethna has researched in the UK, in Europe, India, and China. He's a co-chair of the Academy of Marketing Special Interest Group on entrepreneurial and small business marketing, and has been invited to conduct keynote lectures at the leading institutions in the UK, EU, China, and India. In 2017, he was unanimously elected to become a member of the advisory board of the acclaimed Global Research Conference on Marketing and Entrepreneurship, and is an international board director for the World Zoroastrian Chamber of Commerce. Please join me to give a very warm welcome to Professor Sethna. Would request the attendees to type your questions in the Q&A section with your name and with your email and company addresses so that we can get back at a later stage just in case some questions remain unanswered. We'll take questions as we proceed with the session along the way. Thank you very much. If I may now request Professor Sethna to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Professor Menon, for inviting me here this evening. Well, it's actually afternoon here in the UK, so it sounds a bit weird talking about the evening, but thank you for inviting me here this evening. And to Professor Roy, thank you so much for those very kind words. It's always, I don't know, I find it quite difficult to hear, your kind of life story almost, condensed into 30 seconds there. There's always, many years of trouble and strife that goes into that kind of history, as it were. But so no, thank you for those kind words. So this afternoon, people, I'm going to be talking to you about neuroscience and consumer behavior. Just a few ramblings along the way, and then I'm going to towards the end, perhaps, or at the end of the kind of official narrative or official talk, there's a few other things that I want to touch on, given the emphasis of this research seminar series. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what's sexy as far as research methodology is concerned. I don't know if those two things can be said about in the same sentence. Give you a couple of insights into sort of contemporary issues in marketing, certainly, and where they're going, and where some of you, certainly faculty, might be interested in exploring further. And then lastly, let's have a conversation about the kind of industry-led applied nature of research and where that's going. Excuse me if I'm kind of looking in different places, because I've got Professor Roy and Professor Menon on my screen down here, so I keep looking down here and up at the camera. So unfortunately, I can't move the camera; it's fixed. So let me start by sharing my my screen. I've got a little PowerPoint for you guys. Does that come through okay, Professor Roy?
Yes,
yeah? Fantastic. Good stuff. Excellent. So I am not let's start by kind of giving you a bit more of detail about me and who I am. I'm not a career academic. Okay, so I didn't, unlike some of my colleagues at other institutions, I didn't go from an undergrad to a postgrad to a PhD to a postdoc lecturer and then moving my way up. Oh no, I basically dropped out of school, having done, I don't know what the equivalent is, but having done my O-levels. So at sort of 16, 17 years old. So high school, basically. And to give you a quick kind of motivational story before I kick into the neuroscience behind consumer behavior. On that very last day of school, it was a grammar school, private boys' grammar school. And I hadn't done particularly well because my I had a lot of trauma at home, parents divorced and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, school life was just the last thing on my mind. So I didn't do terribly well. And consequently, I wasn't allowed to go forward to do any other qualifications at school. So I left. And on that very last day, I was walking around the school complex, wanting to say goodbye to some of my favorite teachers. Not many, but just a handful of them. Anyway, so as I was walking down the corridor, I walked past this one particular classroom. My Latin teacher, who was a very tall, lanky kind of figure, who I didn't particularly like anyway. So I wasn't really about to knock on his door to say goodbye to him. But he saw me, and he kind of shouted out from inside the classroom. He said, "Sethna, get in here." I was like, okay. So I went in and said, "Yes, sir." And, you know, I'm looking up at him. He's looking down at me. And I said, "Yes, sir." And he looked at me and he kind of he took his finger and he pointed at me. He pointed down at me and he said, "Listen, you've always been a failure. You always will be a failure. And I really don't want to see you ever again. So get out of my classroom now." That's the only thing he said to me. So I kind of turned around and said, "Okay, sir," and walked straight out of his classroom. And, you know, I'm 50 something now. And the point I'm trying to make to you guys is that I still remember that incident as if it was yesterday. It never goes away, you know, stuff like that. So, you know, teachers can either make you or break you, you know, and then, you know, that's as they say. And I think that's so true, you know, especially the kind of complex world that we live in today, you know. So every time I've achieved, you know, I did all my kind of degrees and everything on a part-time evening school basis, you know, whilst working full-time jobs or running full-time businesses. And every time I had an academic achievement, I would always kind of think back to Mr. Ogilvy and thinking, do you know what, sir? I proved you wrong, you know. So, you know, it's never too late to keep studying, is the first thing. And also, you know, learning is a lifelong thing. You never stop learning. I learn every day. You know, I learn from my colleagues, from my peers, from my students. I learn from my friends, my kids, you know. Yeah, that's just a bit of background on me. 6 businesses over the years, 3 of which are sold and 3 of which are still current as we speak. So I have teams of people who run those businesses for me. And when I came into academia, having had a successful career as a marketer, so everything from marketing assistant all the way through to marketing director for a variety of different SMEs in the UK. When I came into academia, the reason that I actually ended up in teaching was that I'd sold one of my businesses. And having, you know, as you know, all entrepreneurs, you know, work all the hours that God sends. And so I was working 16, 17 hours a day on average for the previous 5 years. So when it came to selling the business or having sold it, I went from working 17 hours a day to 0 hours a day, which was fantastic for about 3 months because I had all this time, which I thought, you know, I've never had before, or at least I haven't had that kind of time in the last 5 years. So I sat in the pub and I started drinking because I could. You know, and who was going to stop me? I had money and I had time. So spent 3 months in the pub drinking. Then I thought, this is really bad for my liver. Let's give something back to the community. And so I started teaching part-time evening courses for the Chartered Institute of Marketing. I already had a teaching qualification, which I had accrued whilst I had my business, because basically my business was into aromatherapy. So we had a team of about 35 aromatherapists that we employed in London and the southeast of England, and we would send them out to the care home industry, so residential care homes and nursing homes. And even though the therapist who we employed was a fully qualified and trained therapist as far as aromatherapy was concerned, we had to, I guess, add some value and retrain her to deal with the kind of clients that we had. And I used to kind of subcontract that out, but that was costing me an absolute fortune. So myself and my sister, who was my partner with, we got a teaching qualification so that we could do that teaching ourselves. So that qualification came in handy when I started teaching at college and evening course stuff. And the rest, they say, is kind of history, because more and more work came my way. And before I knew it, I had this kind of full load of a timetable. But of course, teaching is just one element of what we do as an academic. The other, parts are administration and, of course, research. And so when I was asked, what's your research area, Zubin? It took me a while to kind of figure this out. But, my fallback position would always be that which I know and that which I love. And so they were up until that point in my career, there were two areas of academic sort of practice that I loved, which were marketing and enterprise or entrepreneurship. And so I looked at those two and thought, okay, well, how can I combine these two? And lo and behold, I found some other colleagues who had been doing some research in the space, which they called entrepreneurial marketing. So very conveniently bringing those two domains together. So, started looking at all of that, realized that actually there was very little recent publication back then. And so that's how the Entrepreneurial Marketing Global Perspectives book came about, which took those two disciplines, brought the academic research bang up to date, and consequently became a bestseller in the UK and Europe in entrepreneurial marketing circles. And we still use it to great benefit, actually, because it's got some real nuggets in there. But of course, entrepreneurial marketing, from a business perspective, is one thing, but the other elements of the mix are looking at how your customers behave. And so consumer behavior was also an integral part of my life, and always has been, of course, as a marketer, because why would I bring to market a product or a service which I wasn't confident about in terms of consumers wanting it or needing it, or me feeling that actually I could perhaps change their mindset to eventually want it or need it. So hence the consumer behavior textbooks, which I've been very, very fortunate. Someone up there obviously loves me, but I've been very fortunate that they've done well as well. And currently in the process of writing the 5th edition, which will come out in the UK and Europe next year, so 2022. And I understand that the first reprint edition of the Indian version or India version, Southeast Asia perspective, came out just a few months ago. So really chuffed about that. And I've contributed to a number of other books, from contemporary issues to young consumer behavior to entrepreneurship and luxury as well. So, and all sorts of other things. So that gives you a bit of background on who I am and where I come from and how I landed, on this side of the camera or on the podium, sitting here talking to you guys about neuroscience and consumer behavior. So let me just see if the tech works now. Let me see if that's going to go forward. No. Ah, okay, good. Fantastic. So let's kind of get straight into this then. I guess one of the biggest questions in today's market is really, kind of what drives consumers to decide on, one product instead of another, or why do consumers interact with a specific brand, or a specific organization? So there's kind of a growing interest in understanding how the brain, certainly responses, reflect the decision-making processes of consumers. And that's something that I've been very interested in my professional life, as well as my academic life. So in this regard, the practical use of tools like neuroimaging and neuroscientific tools in real contexts and for real stimuli that is, the subject of this lecture, is named in the literature as neuromarketing. And this term specifically describes a field of study defined as the application of neuroscientific methods to analyze and understand human behavior in relation to markets and marketing exchanges. So this definition really has two main upshots. Number one, it moves consideration of neuromarketing away from being solely the use of neuroimaging by commercial interests for their benefits. But also, number two, the scope of neuromarketing research is widened from solely consumer behavior to include many more avenues of interest. So things like inter and intra-organizational research, which is common in the marketing research literature. Now, neuromarketing actually seeks to investigate different brain areas whilst experiencing marketing stimuli and to find and also report on the relationship between customer behavior and the neurophysiological system. So using the knowledge and the know-how from human brain anatomy and knowing the physiological functions of the different brain areas, it's possible to model neuronal activity that underlies specific human behavior. And so through these neuroimaging methods, researchers can actually compare different brain area activations during a specific task. And we do that in order to try and develop models which can not only describe the sort of dynamics of human decision-making, but also understand the usual mismatches between consumers' thoughts and also their actions. And that's interesting, actually. Just as a side note, if there are any Parsi or Irani Zartostis or Zoroastrians in the audience listening to this, you'll know that thoughts, words, and deeds, or good thoughts, good words, and good deeds are very, very central to a Zoroastrian's tenet, if you like. And so in my academic world, looking at the mismatches between consumer thoughts and their actions or their deeds is kind of interesting. But anyway, so let's, this is not working. So, okay, we go use this. Okay. So I guess for hundreds of years, people have tried to understand how we make or how we should make a decision. And this question is kind of kept alive by some disciplines out there. So philosophy, what is the meaning of life? Or psychology, why the hell did that person behave in that way, or whatever, So, decades of research, millennia of research perhaps have shown that much of our mental processing occurs at the subconscious level, including the decisions that we take as consumers. Many of the decisions that I make as a consumer are done spontaneously, and number two, at a very subconscious level. I genuinely don't think about the stuff that I'm buying on most occasions. And so it's these subconscious processes that explain why we kind of fail so often to accurately predict our own future choice. Often what we think we want has little or no bearing on the choices that we actually make. And so marketers are plagued with the reality that despite widespread use of self-assessment measures, such as surveys and questionnaires, galore, consumers are actually unskilled at retrospective introspection. So the thinking about what I did, why I did, when I did, and how that's going to affect what I do in the future is just completely lost on us. So in search of more objective and reliable kind of insights into consumer thought processes, the use of psychophysiological measures to study consumer behavior began with things like electrodermal responses in the 1920s and pupillary dilation in the 1960s, followed shortly then by eye tracking software and heart rate measures and so on and so forth. And more recently, through technological advances, that's led marketers to use EEG and functional magnetic resonance imaging, so fMRI, and these sorts of applications of neuroscientific techniques to try and study consumers' emotions and the kind of cognitive responses that have spawned, a whole field of consumer neuroscience. But cognitive neuroscience is actually the study of the nervous system that seeks to try to understand the biological basis of behavior. Now, in cognitive neuroscience, the main distinction is between clinical and non-clinical research. And the former, known as neurology, studies the patients and how the nervous system disorders, traumas and tumors and perhaps injuries, affect their cognition, how it affects their emotion, and how it affects their ultimate behavior then, as compared to healthy subject populations. But the second one then studies consumer responses in healthy subject populations. A last critical distinction that I'd like to make is between consumer neuroscience that I've already said refers to kind of academic research at the intersection of neuroscience, and then consumer psychology and/or neuromarketing as we know it, which refers to the kind of application of consumer neuroscience in the marketplace using neurophysiological tools like the eye tracking, like the EEG, like the fMRI, and so on, to conduct very specific market research. Now, neuromarketing can also be defined as the kind of field of study that applies the methodologies of the neuroscience to analyze and understand the human behavior related to market and also economic exchanges. So neuromarketing then is actually related to marketing as neuropsychology is related to psychology. But additionally, neuropsychology studies the relationship between the human brain and the cognitive and psychological functions, whilst what neuromarketing does is actually investigates consumer behavior from a brain perspective. So even if the term neuromarketing can't be attributed precisely to anybody, Professor Ali Schmitz of the Rotterdam School of Management at the Erasmus University is actually known as the first one who used the term neuromarketing that refers to the use of neuroscientific techniques by the marketing discipline specifically back in the year 2002. So the use of neuroscientific techniques in marketing has actually generated a considerable amount of interest and excitement in fairly recent years. And this has been evidenced by an increasing number of publications and also review papers in the area, as well as, I have to say, very, very significant investments by industry-leading marketing research agencies and advertising agencies who have neuroscience divisions. And this includes companies like Nielsen and Ipsos and Millward Brown. So for example, back in 2015, the Journal of Marketing Research, one of the top academic journals in marketing, published a whole special issue on neuroscience and marketing. Now in industry, one of the world's largest marketing research firms, Nielsen, acquired a company called Neurofocus, who were a leading neuromarketing firm back in 2011. And the primary reason for such a heightened interest in neuroscience within marketing is the kind of promise that these neuroimaging techniques and the data that they actually generate may allow researchers to unravel the black box inside the mind of the consumer. Now, behavioral outcomes, as well as consumer processes that are associated with those particular outcomes, are of great importance to marketers. But similar behaviors within an individual and between individuals may then also be elicited as a result of a very highly different underlying psychological process, many of which are not actually readily observable using these traditional research methods that you and I know. And that's why neuroimaging techniques are very, very attractive in marketing applications, because they provide researchers and practitioners with seemingly objective physiological data, and also, of course, are potentially less susceptible to experimenter bias or demand effects. And that's a really, useful perspective for us as researchers, because they can also be more reliable than self-report data. So moving on then, let me outline this afternoon 5 kind of related areas that I'd like to talk about. Number 1, reviewing the foundational tenets of consumer neuroscience. 2, providing you, the participants, with a basic understanding of the neural basis of fundamental cognitive and effective processes. Number 3, providing a selective review of recent research in consumer neuroscience, summarizing common neuroscientific tools and methods, and then lastly, discussing the future of neuroscience in marketing. So let's start with the foundational tenets of consumer neuroscience. Now, we know that human decision-making is carried out through a very complex symphony of neuronal firing and functional circuitry. The neurobiological components underlying cognitive and effective processes rely on non-mutually exclusive functional neuroautonomy. And so it's for this reason that researchers use simplified abstractions of brain areas and neural circuits to organize scientific knowledge. Now, these sorts of abstractions represent the most essential biological components necessary for a given neural process, and they omit many details for brevity. So let's consider 4 neural circuits commonly studied in consumer and decision neuroscience. So that's attention, memory, emotional processing, and then lastly, or fourthly, reward processing. So at any given moment, our senses are kind of bombarded with vastly more sensory information from kind of environmental stimuli than can ever be effectively processed in the brain. And so with a vast disparity between the amount of incoming information that's thrown our way and our processing capacity, determining which information to process and to attend to or not, as the case may be, is critical for decision making. Attentional mechanisms kind of modulate the selective concentration of specific stimuli or certain discrete aspects of stimuli, whilst kind of de-emphasizing or ignoring other stimuli or distractors. Just think about when your partner, husband, wife is talking to you. How much do you actually listen to? How much do you actively ignore? Don't tell my wife that. So 2 primary modes of attention kind of exist. First of all, you've got the kind of bottom-up attention, and then you've got the top-down attention. So whereas bottom-up attention is driven by environmental cues, so for instance, a shocking noise or an unexpected scent or aroma, perhaps. Top-down attention is driven by an individual's internal goals and motivations. So for instance, reading a particular book or the external states that I am subjected to, or an expectation that I may or may not have. So this bottom-up attention is very automatic, it's unconsciously driven. It's essential for first impression judgments of stimuli, So if I said to you, or if I asked you, do you remember the aroma of either aftershave or perfume from your first ever date or your first ever love? I'm sure most of you could still, that memory is ingrained in your psyche, forevermore, and you'll remember that. Also, for example, viewing marketing stimuli, for instance, initial eye movements across aisles or across advertisements are driven by bottom-up factors such as color and brightness. And within the first 2.5 seconds, consumers generally make an average of 4 eye movements. But in contrast, top-down attention is conscious and information that is relevant to a consumer's goals and/or expectations. And therefore, that's given attentional priority and also emphasized, because we've got that expectation that already kind of exists. Whoops, sorry. Memory. Let's think about memory for a second, because in order for past information to influence our future decisions, it has to be encoded, it has to be consolidated, and then it has to be retrieved, right? So defined as any physical change that carries information about the historical past, memory is the brain's mechanism for the retention and then also the subsequent retrieval of information. Now, that kind of retention of information is essential for learning and also determining future actions. And it's for this reason that memory, and decision-making are very, very tightly kind of intertwined. Now, we also know that there are multiple memory systems that exist within the brain. And categorically, there are the 3 different types of memory. There's the sensory memory, there's the short-term or our working memory, and then, of course, there's the long-term memory. Now, evidence also suggests that the amygdala plays a very important modulating role in memory consolidation. And it exists for functioning to determine the strength and the significance of memory traces. Whereas the hippocampus acts as the primary locus of memory processing and subsequent consolidation. And so given that the amygdala is heavily involved in both the emotional processing and the modulation of memory formation, it's not surprising that emotionally arousing experiences are better remembered than non-emotionally arousing experiences. Subjective feelings such as happiness or sadness or fear or anger or surprise or disgust, all of these kind of feelings play a very, very important role in decision-making and post-decision appraisal. Let's not forget that. At the neural level, 2 theoretical approaches for understanding emotion actually exist. The locationist approach, which hypothesizes that discrete emotional categories are tied to specific brain areas, and the physiological constructionist approach, which hypothesizes that emotional processes are constructed from interactions between general neural networks that are not specific to emotional categories. So although significant meta-analytical evidence supporting the psychological constructionist approach exists, the vast majority of past research on emotional processing within the brain actually relies on the locationist approach. So there's a cost-benefit analysis, which is kind of necessary for determining the utility of option alternatives. Now, the dopamogenic circuit, which we referred to previously, which kind of includes the brain areas involved in the neurotransmitter dopamine's synthesis and reception, is broadly associated with reward processing. Now, this circuit reward is actually activated in response to subjectively attractive, desirable resources and also experiences. So, for example, food, and I'm a big foodie, money, sex, drugs, these are the kind of subjectively attractive, desirable resources and experiences that we have. And rewards can actually be separated into two disassociable psychological components. Number one, wanting or incentive salience. And number two, liking or hedonic impact. Wanting, when you want something, that wanting actually promotes the approach and consumption of rewards rather than a kind of withdrawal, if you like, right? So wanting has a motivational component. It's incentive salient and also neurobiologically distinct from liking, because the wanting system is a network of brain processes that govern motivation and is expressed as the kind of desire for rewards. So the wanting system kind of gives a visceral oomph, if you like, to mental desires. And there's evidence for the neural basis of wanting, which has primarily been found in the subcortical brain circuits, with the kind of mesolimbic dopamine system being of very particular importance here. But on the other hand, we have liking, which is the kind of sort of a core process, if you like, of hedonic pleasure. And it's foundational, it's evolutionary, ancestral, and also it's unconscious or implicit. Because the liking system actually regulates pleasure responses and is composed of a very small number of hedonic hotspots in the brain. Now, hedonic responses actually occur in the form of sensory pleasures as well as many higher types of pleasure. So whether we're talking about cognitive pleasure, whether we're talking about social pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, or even moral pleasure. Now, the wanting and liking systems have obvious implications for decision-making by consumers and managers, and also relate to satisfaction. Okay, so before I go into a review of consumer neuroscience and some of the literature, let me stop there just for 5 minutes. I think it's, how long have we been going for, people? Professor Roy, I don't know, good time to stop, see if there's any questions that anyone needs answering at this stage.
Yeah, it's a good time to take a break, yes. There are no questions as yet. Should I take the opportunity to ask one, or are you okay?
Well, I don't mind. I mean, I'm happy to kind of carry on, rumble through, and then take a whole bunch of questions right at the end.
Can I ask one now? Is it okay with you? Because
absolutely.
It relates to what you've taught now.
Go for it, yeah.
So in my previous assignment, 4 or 5 years back, with a global communications agency in the likes of Nielsen and Ipsos that you've talked about, the technology was attempted in Southeast Asian markets. So we had actually done the mind mapping exercise and eye tracking. The mind mapping was around like, concentration, stress, sleepiness, and interest, which is very much aligned to what you just mentioned now, which is attention, the memory part, and the emotional processing, the reward around wanting, liking, right? So we had done that. We had done that to test the recipes of new restaurants getting launched. We were doing that. We had done that to test advertising, with eye tracking and with all sorts of things. So can I talk about the 3 challenges that I faced?
Yeah, please do.
So one of the challenges that we faced was that I'm talking about 2016.
Yep.
So the challenges was it was not scalable at that point in time because the cost of infrastructure and technology was prohibitive market to scale it up, to understand
Yep.
and make it scalable. So we were very, very excited with the sort of outputs in Japan, in sort of Thailand. But when it comes to scaling to larger markets like Indonesia, India, it became a challenge. That was one. The cost was prohibitive because we had to get stuff and we were not getting it locally. The second challenge was the data that was coming out from the mind map, let's say from Japan or Thailand, was not getting calibrated for other markets. So the sort of emotions, the question that I'll have later is, how does a person in India react to like a person in Japan in a similar situation when it comes to mind mapping? So that's why the calibration we could not do. We did not have the right kind of people in markets to write the program, algorithm, and the formula to sort of calibrate. So that was the second challenge. Why I really wanted to make it scalable 4 or 5 years back, because like Nielsen Ipsos, you measured, my agency was also having and invested in that neuroscience division. And the third challenge we faced was trust and transparency. The challenge of educating clients who were used to the age-old legacy system of research, we did road shows, we did demos, we actually put the whole headgear on their head and, we got the data out, right? So maybe I'm a little ahead of the content that you are sharing, I'm not sure, but this is very relevant to the attention, memory, emotional processing and reward that you talked about now. And I can almost relive what I went through 6 years back. Thank you.
Absolutely. No. That's really interesting. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a bit, but you do make some very, very salient points there, Professor Roy. And I can my heart goes out to you. I can very well sympathize with what the journey that you've been on. I guess the scalability issue we can quite easily address now in 2021 because we have the use of AI, right? AI and natural language processing, takes care of that issue, right? AI also, takes care of the calibration issue. And with fear of repeating myself, AI also takes care to a degree of the trust and transparency issues, which may result come as a result of the different cultures that exist right around the world. And we know this because AI and machine learning, does the job that we should have done, or some of us have attempted to do over the years, in terms of understanding the nuances between different cultures and therefore how to calibrate the work that we're doing to resonate with the different audiences that we're trying to speak to. Some people have done it quite well, or as well as we can as humble human beings. But of course, machine learning and AI is doing that job for us. So I think we're in a much, much better place now than we ever were to really kind of engage with that, So what I would say is if you've still got connections, to industry, get stuck in there, because it's a really exciting time to do all of that right now. I am going towards the end because I specifically want to address the point that you were making just now about the differences between, maybe consumers in India and in Thailand, in Malaysia and Singapore and so on and so forth. Yeah, but I'm going to come back to that because that's a much bigger issue that faculty may well be interested in as well. Yes, if that's okay, I'll come back to that later on.
I have, if you don't mind, I have one question myself. So, in fact, I have many such stories of where neuroscience has helped in decision making for marketeers. And I'm curious to know, what is your favorite story? What is your aha moment in how all of the science converted to simple solutions for marketers to apply and see a change in the market?
My aha moment, I think, even as a career marketer, right? So given the fact that when my daughter Maya was born, I had already had 12 years in industry, okay, working in a marketing capacity for different SMEs. I'd had 2 successful businesses by then as well. And I was a chartered marketer, taught the stuff, practiced the stuff, all the rest of it. But even then, my aha moment was 2 years after Maya was born, in fact, 2.5 years after Maya was born, when we were driving somewhere or other. Maya's in the back in the car seat, strapped up, and, you know, we're chatting away, you know. Well, I'm chatting, she's kind of babbling and whatever else, you know. And we drive past a McDonald's, right? And she points out, okay, and she says chips, right? Now, that really took me aback because number one, I'd never taken her to McDonald's, right? Because it's junk food. Why would you want to give your kid, you know, food that's really high in salt content and blah, 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 you know, not good for them. You know, so I'd never taken her to McDonald's, right? But this little bugger knew, you know, and having never been to McDonald's, you know, she could recognize these golden arches. And she'd somehow made the connection between the golden arches and chips. Now, she knew the word chips because we would make homemade chips, right? Unsalted, just potato, right? Now, I don't know where that came from. Did that come from children's TV? Maybe. Did that come from conversations between nieces and nephews or her cousins, you know, older cousins? Maybe, you know, I don't know, you know, but that really kind of took me aback because here was a young person, a small human being who didn't have the ability to actually speak or string complex sentences, yet had the ability to think about what this symbol actually means, you know. And you know, that became the foundation for me of really kind of, you know, all human learning and marketing in the same, in that kind of space, you know. And from then, you know, what me and my wife had been doing previously. So when the kids were in their kind of, you know, even before their first birthday. So, you know, we used to do sign language, you know, so from the minute they were born, we would communicate with our babies using sign language, you know. So, you know, simple things like, you know, are you hungry? You know, do you want milk? You know, and stuff like that. And so we know that, you know, children have the ability to, you know, the motor skills develop way before speech and language skills. And so I could communicate with my children before they can actually speak. Now, if you can do that, and if you know that you can do that, you know that you also have the ability to influence their mindset and their cognition way, way before they can actually even talk back to you, you know, and that's a very, very powerful ability that we have. So that was my little aha moment all those years ago.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so shall we move on then?
Yes,
okay,
Professor.
let me go back to. Okay, all right. So, the goal. Sorry, Professor Roy. Just give me a time check, please. How long have we got left?
So I think we should be. We should try to close by 7:35 to be safe.
Give me that in minutes. How many minutes?
About 15 to 20 minutes to be safe. 15 to 20 minutes. Max.
Okay. Fine. Okay, fine. I will talk quickly. All right. So let me kind of give you a bit of a review then of some consumer neuroscience. So I think the goal of consumer neuroscience really exists to apply neuroscientific theory and methods to try and better understand consumer psychology. And in kind of doing so, what we find is that behavioral theories, behavioral models, and behavioral methods from consumer psychology are actually combined with those from neuroscience in a kind of attempt to appreciate the biological contribution of consumer behavior. So what I'd now like to do is to kind of selectively review literature from 3 key research areas that colleagues and students might find of interest, that consumer neuroscience has actually added very significant value to. So brands, ads, and aspirations, consumer preference and choice, and then lastly, price, product, promotion, and place, or the marketing mix. So brands, ads, and aspirations is actually a module that I teach on my MSc Marketing Psychology degree here at Regent's University. Now, primarily using fMRI, a number of initial studies investigating brand favorability, brand associations, brand recall, and also brand loyalty have actually been conducted, as we know. And research on brand favorability is actually intended to develop a better understanding of the neural mechanisms that are responsible for brand preference. Depe et al. In 2005 showed that when consumers make decisions in which a choice set contains the consumer's favorite brand as compared to a choice set without the consumer's favorite brand, there's an increased activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so these neural correlates of brand favorability appear to be kind of modulated by the anterior cingulate cortex, which has now been shown to predict the degree of bias an individual actually affords a brand on judgments of product attractiveness and also product credibility. There's evidence for a similar kind of biasing of choice by brand preferences when it comes to a lesion study by Koinings and Tranel in 2008, which demonstrated that significant Coke versus Pepsi brand preference reversals between blind and open trials were not observed in patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions, but were observed in healthy consumers. So that is what I'm trying to say there, is that patients with a ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesion had consistent preferences, regardless of whether the brand was present or not, whereas the preferences of healthy consumers were biased when brand information was present. Schaefer and Rotte in 2007 found that activity in the ventral striatum positively correlated with the degree of sports and luxury characteristics of a brand. So, for example, imagining driving a Mercedes versus an unbranded car, but then negatively correlated with a rational choice attribution of the brands. Similarly, there is some evidence that suggests that brands can alter consumption experiences. That is, brand information changes the neural response when consuming the product. So, for instance, let's take some seminal work by McClure et al. In 2004. They looked at consumers who knew that they were drinking Coke versus those who knew that they were drinking Pepsi, or those who didn't know what brand they were drinking. And these consumers displayed neural activation changes in the memory circuit. So the hippocampus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the superior frontal gyrus. So these behavioral preferences for Coke were only partly determined by sensory information, and activation in the memory circuit as a result of brand information biases, such as preferences. And one of the most well-known or well-studied types of brand associations is the so-called brand personality, right? Which kind of posits that brands have personality characteristics similar to humans, and consumers are able to form relationships with those brands in a kind of analogous manner to those formed with people. Now, neuroscientific methods can actually be used to test and validate behavioral measures and claims. And in the case of brand personalities, there was a study by Yoon et al. In 2006, which showed that the neural systems involved in personality judgments of humans are not the same as brand personality judgments. More specifically, personal judgments were actually associated with the activation in the medial prefrontal cortex regions, whilst judgments of brands were actually associated with activation in the left inferior prefrontal cortex, which is typically involved with object recognition. So these kind of results actually illustrate how neuroscientific techniques can illuminate invalid assumptions that can underlie behavioral consumer research, and including, very widely popular kind of ideas and constructs. So brand recall and familiarity and memory for a particular brand have implications for top of mind awareness and brand perceptions. So finally, in this section, what I'd like to do is to look at some initial work on the kind of neural correlates of consumer loyalty, which have validated the importance of loyalty in the marketing environment. So using point of sale scanner data and inviting loyalty card holders of different retailer stores into a neuroimaging laboratory, researchers actually showed that when choosing between purchasing identical clothing items at different retailer stores, consumers who are loyal to a particular store or a particular brand show more activation in the striatum as compared to consumers who are less loyal. That is, what I'm saying is that neural activation patterns show that consumer loyalty results in neural activation patterns that are consistent with the notion that consumers form effective bonds with the store or a brand, and illustrate that the importance of emotional components of consumer loyalty. So why do consumers choose products that they end up actually purchasing? Well, preference formation and choice have been the subject of much research that has been exemplified by choice theories across the fields of marketing and economics and psychology and also political science. But behavioral data can only provide a limited amount of insight into the processes underlying consumer preference and choice. As a complement, neurophysiological data actually provides a very rich insight into the consumer thought processes. And so examining the neurobiological mechanisms underlying preference and choice processes is of great interest to researchers and also to marketers. Now, much of the kind of initial psychophysiological work on consumer preference and choice has focused at the developmental level. So how the individual and their brain is actually shaped by socio-cultural factors during their childhood and their adolescence. But cultural and social influences during physiological development also play a key role in preference formation. So, I talked to you about my daughter earlier on. Children as young as 2 can recognize and represent brand logos. And there have been some very important developmental milestones, such as the representation and recognition of visual stimuli occurring during critical periods of development during an adolescence and also early childhood. And there's much research evidence out there for critical period of preference formation for musical taste. So by correlating musical preferences and the participants' age at the time, selected songs were popular. So researchers show a very strong evidence that musical preference formation occurs in the early 20s. Now, understanding preference formation is absolutely essential because preference or preferences ultimately influence choice. Many of the influential choices, including environmental factors at the time of decision, such as location of a product on a particular shelf or in a particular store, or the number of products being chosen from, and the other biological factors, such as the ability to remember which product one bought previously, or perhaps misremembering crucial information about a product's attributes. All of these will go into our decision-making process. Now, a common challenge faced by 21st century consumers when presented with choice decisions amongst alternatives is the overwhelming availability of many other alternatives. Given the kind of constraint on memory and attention leading choice theory or theories actually postulate that consumers first filter the alternatives into a small set prior to making a final decision, or the choice set that we have kind of talked about. So let's move on to the marketing mix then, also known as the 4 Ps as we kind of know them, the foundational categorical concept in marketing, representing the 4 essential aspects of marketing campaigns. So we can talk about a lot of this. I'm sure much of this is kind of or the intangible features of a product, such as the product design. We know that these have implications for the success of a particular product. So, for example, it's now clear to us that modifying the marketing mix, so modifying the price or the product or the place or the promotion, all of these will influence experienced utility of products above and beyond the kind of intrinsic aspects of the products. So, for example, taste. Price differences have been shown to markedly impact product perceptions. There was a great seminal study demonstrating the malleability of price perceptions, which showed that not only does price influence quality, but neural activation differs as a result of expectations created by price points. So whether we believe something is cheap and nasty, or we think that something is, has an expensive price tag and therefore probably has a lot of quality associated with it. So Baresman et al. In 2008 conducted a study showing that consumers who tasted the same wine on multiple occasions were actually made to believe the samples had different prices. That is, that they tasted the same wine, exactly the same wine, but believed that it was either cheap or expensive between tastings. But they were actually experiencing the same wine samples differently at different times. And therefore, beliefs about quality, beliefs about price had altered activation in the medial orbitofrontal cortex when tasting wine. Another price-related concept that evidence from consumer neuroscience contribute to is the willingness to pay. In a study investigating the neural correlates of the willingness to pay, or the maximum price that an individual would be willing to pay for a given product, researchers actually scanned hungry participants and asked them how much they would be prepared to pay for a variety of foods. Neural activation results like these are actually beginning now to shed some light on how our brain computes and represents value in everyday choices. And I can tell you that, with the current kind of fuel shortage in the UK, people are prepared to pay any amount of money to get their fuel, and so we know that, there's a big impact here. I'll talk to you briefly about kind of eye tracking studies just for a second, because we know that these have shown that automatic kind of visual attentional biases also exist. So for example, amongst products on a shelf, there's a visual attentional bias towards the upper visual field and the right visual field. And that means that products that are placed on the upper shelves and to the right, that way for you, are given a categorical preference and also receive a longer eye fixation, In online settings, there's a strong visual bias towards information that's presented in the center of the computer screen. Amongst similar items presented in an online setting, products that were placed in the center of the screen versus products placed elsewhere are nearly 60% more likely to be selected. And yes, that is me in the center there. So neuroscientists actually use a very broad array of methods to study the brain, its behavior, and the intersections. Importantly, these methods differ in the spatiotemporal resolution at which they measure brain activity, in which they look at invasiveness, and in which the type of brain activity that they actually measure. So, for example, the correlation versus the causational observations. Now, in human studies, the most commonly used methods for recording brain activity are EEG or fMRI. And these techniques are now popular because they can be administered to healthy adult populations and are also non-invasive. I'm going to kind of, just move on basically just because of time, okay? There's a, on the screen there, you can see some keywords, and there's a whole bunch of studies that I'd encourage you to go and find at some stage. And once you've looked at some of those studies, you will see that as the kind of biological influences of consumer behavior have become better understood and accepted, there is a necessity for integrative approaches across neuroscience and marketing. And additionally, technologies available for non-invasively measuring biological features are actually becoming less expensive and more readily available. And this has opened up many neurophysiological avenues to marketers for future research. Now, in the next part of my kind of mutterings, what I'd like to do is to touch on just 5 key topic areas that I believe will be essential to the future of neuroscience in marketing. And those are the 5 that you see on the screen there. Now, much of neuroscience has to date kind of in marketing and consumer behavior has been fragmented by examining the very kind of narrow psychological processes, so the attention, the memory, and emotional reactions. But a need exists for studying basic integrative psychological processes that actually address the fundamental aspects of decision-making and involve multi-brain regions in a very holistic way, right? And so there are 3 basic integrative processes that deserve greater scrutiny. 1 is the theory of mind, 2 is the empathy or mirror neurons, and 3 is the behavior combining theory of mind and empathy. Now, theory of mind concerns mentalizing in communications contexts and refers to how people infer the beliefs, the thoughts, the feelings, the desires, the traits, and the decisions and the intentions of other people. So research in autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders has actually implicated the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporal poles, and the temporal parietal junction. And that is because essential psychological processes that are involved in the theory of mind include taking the perspective of others, inferring what others are thinking, and then attributing causes or reasons for one's own behavior or the behavior of others, and aspects of moral decision-making. And of course, we know that in folks who are perhaps autistic, they don't have that ability, right? And so to the extent that marketers wish to understand and influence buyer decision-making behavior, the study of the theory of mind processes can actually provide basic insights into decision-making, preference formation, choice, and also patterns of behavior. Empathy is not an emotion, right? But it's rather a compound psychological trait or a state composed of empathetic concern or an affective reaction, taking the perspective of others, which is largely a cognitive theory of mind process, and then self-other differentiation, which is a process related to the identity and psychological distress. So empathy is a fundamental human mental process that is very much embedded in many levels of consumption. And therefore, neuroscience methods and tools are valuable for studying empathy because it occurs when consumers engage in purchase of gifts, when they interact with other consumers in joint decision-making, when they engage in transactions with salespeople, when they learn about the abuse of animals, when they look at the plight of people in poverty, or experience natural disasters through advertising appeals, and many, many other everyday kind of situations. Indeed, if you look at early economic thought by David Hume and Adam Smith, economic theory, they both stressed the role of empathy in business. They used the word sympathy, however, because empathy hadn't actually entered into the English lexicon at that time. Now, empathy is a foundation of many marketing concepts and informs strategic management decisions. The emotional resonance or resonance aspects of empathy, so those that are reflected in the feelings of compassion for the suffering of others, and also empathetic concerns and kindness towards others, have also all been found to be associated with regions of the brain identified that use the mirror neuron system. Many actions, folks, that are taken by consumers and managers involve a number of mental processes that are organized in very complex ways, right? So as an example, one study investigated the boundary conditions of sales account managers' self-interests in business relationships by studying the role of Machiavellism, right, in decision-making, yeah? And, if you look at kind of Machiavelli, a kind of social construct in which a person manipulates others for self-gain, and is conceptually similar to psychopathic and sociopathic behavior, right? So I'm going to move on now to, just very briefly, looking at genetic influences, right? The genetic or the Human Genome Project, which sequenced the entire human genome, was completed in 2001 at a cost of nearly $3 billion US. And between the years 2008 and 2017, the rate of decrease in the cost of genetic sequencing per megabase of DNA has far surpassed Moore's law, which described the doubling rate of computer power and acts as a kind of a benchmark for technological success. And as human DNA sequencing costs have become ever more affordable and genetic data becomes more accessible to all of us, marketing researchers and practitioners will have the ability to understand potential genetic influences on consumer behavior. And Professor Roy, this specifically answers your question from earlier on in terms of how we as different cultures respond to different stimuli.
Yes.
And to date, there's been a dearth of research linking genes and behavior, particularly in the kind of applied sciences. So many consumer decisions are made within social contexts. So whether it's purchasing with others or whether it's buying interaction with salespeople and so on and so forth, right? But there has been much laboratory research which is conducted in isolation from the social context. And so it's for this reason that researchers kind of argue for the importance of inclusion of these social contexts in studies using neurophysiological measures, and of particular relevance here to understanding of how social situations actually influence consumption, and also other marketing relevant research areas in how individuals perceive others' thoughts about situations and then use that information to actually influence their own thoughts, whether it's cross-country or international or within country. And so it's been found, for example, that greater attention was actually allocated to viewing luxury brands, and greater motivational emotional reactions occurred for people observing such brands when in the presence of other people versus doing it on their own, right? And so these kind of attentional and emotional differences in social situations can largely be explained by social facilitation theory, which is one of the kind of views that neuroscience studies in consumer research could utilize to study social processing rather than limiting research to observational individuals in isolation. So I think I'm probably going to now just kind of, I'm going to move up, okay? So really in summary, in this kind of very short session that I've had with you today, I've kind of whizzed around on my boosted board, which is the board that you see there. It's an electric skateboard. It does 24 miles per hour. And I've kind of presented to you just a very selective overview of neuroscience and marketing. And in doing so, I've reviewed foundational research from neuroscience on which consumer research actually builds. I've discussed the exemplary contributions from consumer neuroscience. And with a critical mass of researchers out there conducting work at top academic institutions around the world, like Regents and like Flame, and publishing in top-tier marketing and non-marketing journals. The field of consumer neuroscience is actually poised to continue to develop, to expand, and to add much value to the field of marketing as a whole. Now, neuroscience findings provide a unique information about the consumer that can't otherwise be observed using these traditional behavioral approaches. So the use of neuroscientific theories and methods, and perhaps more broadly, psychophysiological approaches, has actually added and will continue to add a considerable amount of unique value to the field of marketing. But ultimately, people, neurophysiological findings are actually essential to the scientific pursuits attempting to unravel the kind of foundational processes that underlie consumer behavior, and also to the scientific or the progression of scientific knowledge in marketing. So with that, I end, and I thank you for your time. That is my absolutely gorgeous and beautiful campus, Regent's University in the middle of Regent's Park in central London. So if you ever, guys and girls, if you're ever down here in London, please do give me a shout and come and join me for a coffee or a beer. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and look up here at the camera, wave, and look down at you guys so I can see you and say, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I think we can, if
I have one more question that came to my mind when I was listening to all the great work that's happening. The question is around researchers who would like to do research in this area but do not have the kind of equipment or facilities. So I'm kind of imagining this, setup where there is an MRI scanner, there is an EEG machine, and so on and so forth, eye trackers to help you, answer the questions that come to your mind related to consumer behavior. But without this, how easy or difficult is it for researchers to be able to, conduct this kind of research?
Right. Okay. So this is an age-old problem that we have, Professor Menon, that as researchers in university, our budgets are very, very limited. Any research money that we have, we have to beg, steal, borrow, and it's tight. Okay, we know that. And so going to your heads of research or research directors saying that you want to do this funky research and you need X amount of dollars for it may not always wash. Okay, that's where I think collaboration with industry, okay, and the industry-led research really comes into its own. Because if you can go out there and craft these industry collaborations, if you can tell folks out there that the work that you're going to do is going to add direct value to their bottom line, okay, suddenly ears prick, right? And they become very, very interested, because remember, you're the researchers, you're the research experts, okay? And it's, they will bow down to you to give them those consumer insights. But of course, reality says they're the ones with the money, so they put the money up, you go buy the nice fancy equipment, you do the research, you tap into their customer base potentially, and happy days for everyone, You get what you want and they get what they want. They get further insights into the psyche of their consumers, and you have the ability to be able to tap down into that psyche using that equipment. And of course, once you've got that equipment, stuff, this is the way that I've done it in the past, all it needs is one project to buy the equipment, finish that project, get the results, disseminate the results, and you move on to client number 2. But of course, now you come with an added advantage because you already have some equipment, right? So now with client number 2 or industry partner number 2, you go buy some different equipment, and so the whole cycle goes basically. But I think industry-led research, to answer your question from a strategic perspective, the collaborations there, applied research has to be the way to go. I think absolutely gone are the days where we as academics can sit in our little offices, little hovels, and churn out lots of super research, which no one gives a damn about, really, you know, apart from you, because you're the author, the editor of that 4-star journal, because they're the editor of the 4-star journal, and because and your mum or your dad, because they love you to bits and will listen to anything that you have to say. You know, the big wide world, you know, wants to see that this stuff actually matters in their lives.
And just to bring that sort of perspective, at Flame University, we have, you know, very good mix of professors who are practitioners and who bring that sort of linkage with the industry, as well as hardcore academicians who bring the theoretical, if I may say so, knowledge. And we are hoping that within Flame itself, we build those collaborations, and then we are able to kind of create an example of how, you know, both of these meet and can work and do wonders in the space of both research as well as advancing knowledge.
Absolutely.
Plus making some money.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Menon. So I think good time to conclude now. Before we conclude today, we would like to convey our sincere gratitude to Professor Sethna.
Sorry, Professor Roy, can I just very, very briefly, okay, I did say to you earlier on, I wanted to just mention 2 other things, okay?
Yeah, please.
Which you guys might be interested in. I think number 1, okay, is in terms of research. I know I've talked a lot about kind of the neuroscience and the physiological aspects of research. You guys might want to look at narrative theory, okay? Look at narrative theory. Look at storytelling. I'm a qualitative person, and both of those are extremely, extremely useful and will help you to tell that research story as well. So look at that. And number 2, in terms of contemporary issues in marketing, specifically for you guys as my audience today, what I'd like you to do is to think about something. Some of you may have heard of a lady called Professor Saraswati, okay, who is at University of Virginia, Darden, in the US, and she's also the author of the theory of effectuation, right? Great theory applied to enterprise in all sorts of ways. But recently, the theory of effectuation people have started to question it. And the reason that they've questioned it is because they've said that when Professor Saraswati conducted that research, she conducted that research with a very particular group of people within society. So white, middle class, 60-something-year-old men, right? And the theory was developed on the back of that, right? Is that applicable to everyone around the world? Possibly, possibly not, but it's being questioned, okay? Now, whether the people who are questioning that are right or wrong, I'm not here to debate. The point I'm trying to make to you folks is there are many, many theories around the world that we have in academia that have been developed in different parts of the world that we use as generic, but there is absolutely no compulsion for you to use it as a generic theory because it may or may not be applicable to everyone, you know? So question everything, folks, right? You know, it might, you know, its applicability may not exist in India, you know, and as the world shifts its focus across to your part of the world now, you know, in all sorts of ways, you're at the pivotal point of being able to question it. And if it's not applicable, what is applicable? Present that to the world, please. You know, so that's what I'd like to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sethna. That was fantastic. I think thanks for giving us a glimpse of your childhood, you know, and the teacher who wanted to pin you down, saying you're a failure, which turbocharged your confidence and determination. I think that's a great story to begin with. And thank you for taking us through the learning curve and the journey of consumer psychology, you know, to neuroscience, and then with the advent of technology to neuromarketing. I think that was fascinating. I think it's a great journey. I think what we understood later was that there's a huge untapped potential in terms of measurement, whether it's brand-related measurement, whether it's, using neuro methods and tools that you talked about. There's a huge potential that Professor Menon has also talked about, which is the possibility of research, right? So, you know, the marketing fraternity in India can really benefit, even if one of us can crack with industry, like you said. And thank you very much. This is fascinating, and there's a lot to think about and a lot to do from this session today. So thank you very much. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Dishan Kamdar, for blessing the whole initiative. A big thank you to our Associate Dean, Professor Sajid Narayana, for facilitating this the same, and our Head of Department and Professor Dr. Preetha Menon for being the driving force for this series so far. And finally, a big thank you to our IT and marketing team for ensuring a smooth execution for this session, and especially Vakya for staying there in the initial stages. Thank you very much. Good evening, goodbye, and see you next time. Thank you, Professor Sethna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zubin. I mean, you know, we met about 3 years ago, and you know, it has always been a pleasure interacting with you, getting you to the universities that I have been in. And, you know, he's one person who I can always look to whenever we want to have any sort of discussion, whether academic or otherwise. So
thank you very much.
Hoping to bring you here soon.
Indeed, I'd love to be there.
And here's another sneak peek that we are going to adopt the book that you have written on consumer behavior, the Southeast Asian version, with our students. And yeah, and I hope to get back to you with some feedback as well, you know, candid, on ground from the students, you know, as a method.
Definitely. Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.